Hi, welcome back to the Old Shed Workshop. If this is your first time here, I'm Mike, and I'd like to invite you to like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications for future videos. You folks out there that have been liking my videos and spending some time watching have really helped me to grow my channel. Today is something a little bit different. I've been asked to rebuild an old sentimental flexible flyer sled. Let's show you how I'm going to do it. So here's the sled. This sled has sentimental value to the woman who asked me to rebuild it for her. It was found on a farm in Seekonk, Massachusetts. Looks like it's in pretty bad shape, but it has sentimental value to her. So I'm going to rebuild it. Let's start taking it apart. Well, I finally got it apart. Most of the screws had to be cut off. Everything was so rusted, I just couldn't get them apart. So this is what's left. So now it's time to sand all the metal and get that ready for paint. The sanding portion of this was kind of difficult to record because of the shadows. I'm working outside under a tree, but here it is. Sanded the best I could with an air tool, an air grinder. Looks good. Now I'm going to go into the shop and use the old pieces as patterns to cut the new pieces. I'm just going to run these pieces through the planer to get a uniform thickness before I transfer the old pieces using them as patterns. Now with the pieces planed so they're all the same thickness, I've transferred the shapes onto the pieces using the old pieces as templates. Now it's off to the bandsaw to cut them out. I have my two-stage dust collector ready to go, and I'm going to cut out the pieces. In order to sand the two pieces that'll be the outside pieces on the sled and get them exactly the same profile, I've put them into my Moxon vise. If you're not familiar with what a Moxon vise is, I'll put a link up above. This gives me the opportunity to sand both pieces at the same time to make sure the contour is exactly the same. Minor adjustment. The sanding to make sure the pieces are evenly contoured is done. Now I'm over at my router table. I have a quarter round rounding over bit, and I just want to take off the sharp edges on all the pieces just to give them a little relief. I have my two-stage dust collection system all connected, and I'm ready to go. All my pieces have the sharp edges rounded off with the rounding over bit now. Now all I have to do is the final sanding and get the pieces ready for finish. I've got all the pieces sanded out to 150. I'm ready to start applying finish. This is what I use, made by Minwax, polyacrylic, crystal clear top coat. I've had good luck with this. I like the way it goes on. It dries relatively quickly. You can scuff it in between coats with a Scotch-Brite pad and put a second coat on probably within an hour or two. That's what I'm about to start putting on these pieces for finish. With all the pieces now in finish, I'm ready for assembly. Assembly has proven to be a much more complicated endeavor than I anticipated. There's several things I've tried in the probably hour and a half I've spent trying to get the whole sled square. When I first started out trying to get all the pieces together for assembly, I tried using a clamp this way, pushing outward. I tried putting that inside the runners with an opposing clamp, pulling it in, thinking that way the runners can't wobble. That didn't work. There's just not enough hands to pull that together. I tried to measure between the runners, thinking that if I could get the same measurement between the runners, I would get the runners straight. First thing I did was I put a piece of scrap plywood in my vise so I could get both runners against the piece of plywood, and that way the whole sled wouldn't be raked. I was able to achieve that. Trying to measure between the runners to get an even measurement proved difficult because the front of the runners tapers in. So I couldn't get the same measurement here as I could get here because of the taper. What do I do now? I clamp down the runners to the bench here. As long as I know they're not raked, I can keep them straight. And I got a reasonable measurement between this support and this support, thinking this has the most structure because the whole thing wants to cant as you're trying to work with it. So you got to stop the raking and the canting all at the same time with only two hands. Now I've gotten this far into it, I'm trying to figure out how to square up the cross pieces, I'll call them cross members, and the long rails. In order to do that, I finally come up with an idea to take the frontmost cross member and secure it to these structural pieces first. The cross member attaches separately from this long rail. The steering arms go underneath, they go on top of the cross member, but underneath the long rail. I've taken measurements from this structural support out to the end of the cross members, gotten that even, and made a mark inside where the cross member will mount to this structural support piece. I can flip it over and tack the cross member in place. Flip it back over, and I can take my measurements in a square, and once I have the long rails in the cross member square, I can determine any overlap here and here from the edge of the long rail, keeping the steering arm underneath. And I think right now that once I have that square, I can work my way back. And if I develop the same overlap in the back, I should have it true. In the back, the long rail and the cross member go over the top of the runner that comes up and bolts. The whole thing bolts right through. So if I can get this all straight and square, then I'll be able to start bolting the pieces together. What I've done to this point is, when I made my mark inside, I had a measurement from the end of the support out to the end of the cross member. I came in the same amount to the center of these ovals that I marked out. The same measurement from each side put me in the center of those ovals. And then I found center from edge to edge, and I made these marks so I know where center is inside where the piece attaches to the structural support piece. I'm going to get it into its position and then put a few small screws in just to hold it together. I screwed in that topmost cross member. I do have the runner still up against a piece of plywood in my vise, so the whole piece can't rake. So I put the second cross member in place. I took the measurements, the same measurements that I had here, and I used them here, and I've secured that piece from the bottom. Now you can get a good look at the fact that the cross members mount separately from where the long rails are going to bolt through. I'm going to mark these holes while I have the opportunity. Because I have to be straight through the long rails, through this hole, through the cross member, and through the long rail, and through the hole that's in the steering arm. So that should give it some structural integrity now to flip it back over. I lined up the rail with the leading edge of the first cross member over the top of the steering arm. I marked with an awl up through the hole to get my point for my drill. Rather than risk having tear out in the top, I flipped the piece over and drilled a small pilot hole first, and then I flipped it over right side up and drilled my hole in from the top, so I didn't get any tear out. After all the measuring and squaring up with a square, I have the rails all bolted to the cross members. Here's the detail I mentioned before, that the steering arms go between the cross member and the rail. I have the steering mechanism attached. All I have to do now is add the three top pieces that form the sled. These bolts I thought I was going to be able to use 1/4-20s. These bolts are 3/16. 1024 is actually a 3/16 bolt. This thing was held together with screws and nails and whatever they had available to try to keep this thing together. So now I'm going to fit up the top 3 pieces, and I'm going to secure them with stainless steel screws. I have the centerpiece all aligned. I have the first 2 screws into the cross member. Now I just have to finish screwing it in, and then I'll fit the 2 side pieces. I have all the main pieces screwed in to the cross members with stainless steel screws. This completes this portion of the build. The only thing I have left to do is to get an original Flexible Flyer decal just to finish it off. In my research to try to identify what this sled was originally, the best I've come up with for a model designation is a P1048 or Paricon, Paricon 1048. I'm basing that on this specific detail. I'm sure some of you watching this are much more knowledgeable about flexible flyer sleds, and hopefully you can put in the comments what you think the model of this sled is. It's a 48-inch sled. Now I'm going to put the decals on. That should finish it up. Okay, I have the decals on now, and I've put 2 coats of Minwax polyacrylic on just to seal the decals in. This has been a fun but very challenging project. Thanks for staying with me during it, and we'll see you on the next one.